In the spring of 1951, the most decorated soldier in American history sat in an office in Tokyo and waited for a telephone call. He did not yet know the call was coming. He did not know that a young aide was, at that very moment, writing the words that would end his career. He did not know that the President of the United States had already signed the order. He only knew that something was wrong. And that at the age of 71, after 52 years in uniform, after 3 wars and 100 battles, and the surrender of an empire on the deck of an American battleship, the long road was finally coming to an end. His name was Douglas MacArthur, and this is the story of his last days in command. The day America fired its greatest general, the day a hero was sent home. To understand what happened in April of 1951, you have to understand who Douglas MacArthur had become by then. He was not a man. He was a monument. His father had won the Medal of Honor at the Battle of Missionary Ridge during the American Civil War. Douglas himself had won the Medal of Honor in the Philippines in 1942. He was the only son in American military history to win the medal that his father had won before him. He had graduated first in his class at West Point in 1903. He had commanded the Rainbow Division in France in the First World War. He had served as Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s. He had stood on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, and accepted the surrender of the Empire of Japan. He had then, almost single-handedly, rebuilt that empire into a peaceful democracy. For 5 years, as Supreme Commander of the Allied powers in occupied Japan, MacArthur had governed 70 million people. He had written their constitution. He had restructured their economy. He had given Japanese women the right to vote. He had refused to allow the trial of the emperor. By 1950, the Japanese people did not call him an occupier. They called him Gaijin Shogun, the foreign shogun. They lined the streets when his car drove past. They bowed when his name was spoken. And then, on June 25, 1950, North Korean tanks crossed the 38th parallel. President Harry Truman in Washington made the decision to commit American forces to defend South Korea. And the man he chose to command those forces was the most experienced general in the United States military. Douglas MacArthur was 70 years old. He had not led troops in combat in 5 years. But he was, in Truman's words, the only man for the job. What followed, in the autumn of 1950, was perhaps the most brilliant military operation of MacArthur's career. The North Korean army had pushed American and South Korean forces all the way down the peninsula, into a small defensive perimeter around the city of Busan. They were on the verge of breaking through. And on September 15, 1950, MacArthur launched an amphibious landing 200 miles behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. His own staff had told him it was impossible. The tides at Incheon were among the most extreme in the world. The harbor was narrow. The sea walls were high. Every senior officer in the Pentagon had advised against it. MacArthur had listened to all of them, and then he had ordered the landing anyway. It worked. The North Korean army, cut off from its supply lines, collapsed within weeks. American forces drove north past the 38th parallel, past Pyongyang, all the way to the Yalu River, the border with communist China. And it was at the Yalu River that the trouble began. In late November of 1950, 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu and attacked the American forces in North Korea. The retreat that followed was one of the most brutal in American military history. The Marines fought their way out of the Chosin Reservoir in temperatures of 40 below zero. American units were overrun. American prisoners disappeared into Chinese camps from which most would never return. And in Tokyo, Douglas MacArthur came to a conclusion. He believed the war could not be won by half measures. He believed Korea was now a war with China, not a war with North Korea. And he believed that to win it, America had to do what it had not yet been willing to do. Bomb the Chinese supply bases inside Manchuria, blockade the Chinese coast, use the nationalist Chinese forces on Taiwan to open a second front on the mainland, and, if necessary, use atomic weapons. President Truman did not agree. Truman believed that expanding the war into China would trigger a Third World War. The Soviet Union had already developed atomic weapons. A direct American attack on Chinese territory could bring Soviet forces into the conflict. The continent of Europe could be lost. The world could burn. Truman issued an order. American military commanders were not to make public statements about war strategy without clearance from Washington. MacArthur ignored it. For the next 4 months, in interviews, in letters, in messages to Congress, MacArthur made his disagreement public. He told a reporter that the restrictions placed on him were an enormous handicap. He wrote a letter to Republican Congressman Joseph Martin, a letter that was read aloud on the floor of the House of Representatives, in which he said, "There is no substitute for victory." He was, in effect, telling the American people that the President of the United States was wrong. In Washington, in the first week of April 1951, Harry Truman made up his mind. He called in his closest advisors. He showed them MacArthur's recent communications. He asked them, one by one, what they thought. The Secretary of State agreed. The Secretary of Defense agreed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed. Douglas MacArthur, the most famous general in America, had to be relieved of command. Truman signed the order on April 10, 1951. The plan was for MacArthur to be informed in person by Secretary of the Army Frank Pace, who happened to be visiting Korea at the time. But the news leaked. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune got wind of it. The White House, fearing that MacArthur would resign before he could be fired and turn his removal into a political weapon, moved up the announcement. At 1 in the morning on April 11, 1951, Washington time, the press secretary read the statement to a room full of reporters. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur had been relieved of all his commands. In Tokyo, it was already afternoon. MacArthur was hosting a luncheon at the American Embassy. His wife Jean was there. His aides were there. They were eating and laughing and talking about the war. A young aide came into the room with a piece of paper in his hand. He walked to MacArthur's chair. He whispered something. He gave him the paper. MacArthur read it. He looked up. He looked at his wife. He said very quietly, "Jeannie, we're going home at last." He did not raise his voice. He did not protest. He did not call Washington. He simply finished his lunch. 5 days later, on April 16, 1951, Douglas MacArthur left Japan. The Japanese government had declared a national day of mourning. 2 million people lined the route from the embassy to the airport. The Emperor of Japan came to the embassy in person, the first time in Japanese history that an emperor had visited the residence of a foreign official. He bowed. He thanked MacArthur for what he had done for Japan. He said goodbye. The motorcade moved slowly through the streets of Tokyo. Japanese citizens stood in silence as it passed. Some held flowers. Some held signs in English that read, "We shall miss you." Some simply bowed as the car went by. At the airport, an honor guard of American soldiers stood at attention. MacArthur saluted them. He climbed the stairs of the aircraft. He turned at the top and looked back at the country he had governed for 5.5 years. He waved once. He stepped inside. The aircraft was named Bataan after the campaign of 1942, in which MacArthur had lost the Philippines and from which he had escaped, vowing to return. He had returned. He had won. And now he was leaving Asia for the last time. He was 71 years old. He had not set foot in the United States in 14 years. The flight took 32 hours. When the aircraft landed in San Francisco on the night of April 17th, the largest crowd in the city's history was waiting. 500,000 people. They had come not to protest his firing. They had come to welcome him home. The motorcade from the airport to the hotel took 2 hours because the streets were so packed that the cars could barely move. Women were weeping, men were saluting, children were holding flags. In New York City, 4 days later, the parade was even larger. 7.5 million people, more than had turned out for Eisenhower in 1945, more than had turned out for any returning hero in American history. The ticker tape that fell from the windows of Lower Manhattan was measured afterward at 3,000 tons. It was, by every measurable standard, the greatest welcome America had ever given to one of its sons. And in the middle of it, on the morning of April 19, 1951, Douglas MacArthur stood before a joint session of the United States Congress to give a speech. The chamber was full. The galleries were full. 30 million Americans listened on the radio. It was the largest audience in the history of American oratory up to that point. MacArthur spoke for 34 minutes. He defended his strategic views. He explained his disagreements with the administration. He talked about the men he had commanded, the soldiers, the Marines, the airmen, the sailors, who had served under him from the jungles of New Guinea to the snows of Korea. He talked about duty. He talked about country. He talked about honor. And then, in the final minute of the speech, he closed with these words: "I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all of my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barracks ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye." He stepped back from the microphone. The chamber was silent for a long moment, and then it erupted. Members of Congress wept openly. The galleries gave him a standing ovation that lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Across America, 30 million people sat at their kitchen tables and their living rooms and listened to the radio in silence. Veterans of 2 world wars saluted in their own homes. Mothers who had lost sons in the Pacific stood beside their radios. The country, for one brief moment, set aside its disagreements and listened to an old man say goodbye. That is the moment your fathers and grandfathers remember. That is the moment many of you remember if you were alive in April of 1951. The day Douglas MacArthur came home, the day he stood before Congress, the day he said the words that became, in the end, the title of his own life. He never held command again. He retired to a suite in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, where he lived for the rest of his life with his wife Jean. He gave occasional speeches. He wrote his memoirs. He met with foreign dignitaries. He was offered the Republican nomination for president in 1952, and he refused it. He had already endorsed his old friend Dwight Eisenhower. He lived for another 13 years. He watched the Korean War end in stalemate. He watched the rise of the Cold War he had warned about. He watched a younger generation of generals fight a new kind of war in a country called Vietnam. On April 5, 1964, Douglas MacArthur died in Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. He was 84 years old. His body lay in state, first in New York, then in Washington, then in Norfolk, Virginia, where he was buried. More than 150,000 Americans came to pay their respects. President Lyndon Johnson attended the funeral. So did former President Eisenhower. So did the family of Harry Truman, the man who had fired him 13 years earlier. Truman himself was too ill to attend, but he sent a wreath and a personal note. The 2 men had reconciled, quietly, in the last years of their lives. They had understood by then that they had both been doing what they believed was right. Douglas MacArthur is buried beside his wife in a small memorial in Norfolk. The inscription on his tomb is simple: his name, his ranks, the dates of his service. There is something I want you to think about now that we have reached the end of this story. In April of 1951, a president fired a general. The Constitution of the United States gave him that right, and he used it. The general did not protest. He did not resist. He did not threaten. He came home. He gave a speech. He faded away. This is what civilian control of the military looks like. This is the system that the founders of this country built, and the system that, against all the pressures of pride and power and personal grievance, held in the spring of 1951. Douglas MacArthur could have made it different. With one telephone call to the right people, he could have made the firing into a political weapon. He could have run for president. He could have torn the country in half. He chose not to. He chose instead to be an old soldier, to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty, to say goodbye and walk away. That is the man America sent home in April of 1951. Not a perfect man, not an easy man, not always a wise man, but in the end, a soldier who knew when his time had come. The last days of Douglas MacArthur, the day America sent its hero home.